Before we start, since it is a small group, just to help me, could you just all go around and say your name and the organization you're with?
Sure. Bill Martinez, Executive Director of the South Lake Tahoe Family Resource Center.
Jude Wood, Executive Director, Boys and Girls Club of Lake Tahoe.
Dick Young, Executive Director at Zephyr Point Presbyterian Conference Center. Go.
Good morning, Chelsea Thomas, Executive Director at Live Violence Free.
And I'm Karen Hauser. I'm the Board President for Encompass Youth.
Becky DeForest with the California Fire Safety Council.
I'm Beth Wallace with Bread and Broth here in South Lake Tahoe.
I'm Kathy Lishman with Friends of Seniors.
Harold Singer with the Marine Research and Education.
Nicole Ramirez Thomas with Valhalla Tahoe.
Nancy Harrison, Lake Tahoe Community College Foundation.
Caitlin Smith, also Lake Tahoe Community College Foundation.
I'm Molly Huckelbridge Coolidge, and I'm the Director of Administration at the Boys and Girls Club.
I heard one person say they were a board member. Are there other board members here as well? That's good, because I think this governance thing is really important for board members, obviously, and for board, but also staff and board working together. And we'll talk about the various roles where those where they should intertwine, where they shouldn't intertwine. So having a representative of both staff and board is really important. So
Can I mention something?
Sure.
I'm an all-volunteer organization.
Okay.
So just so there may be others too that are
Okay.
here.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. Because what we will try to do, well, we'll talk about it a little bit. So anyway, so the objectives, real quick here, for today are to build on the information that was shared at the sort of intro governance class last year or 2 years ago. Who in this room went to that? Oh, great. Okay, so you know at that session there was a lot of real fundamental conversation about governance and board governance. This will hopefully dive a little deeper based on some survey that we sent out, or that Chris sent out, I should say, 3 weeks ago. And how many of you recall that and took that survey? Okay, good. Well, this is good. So what we saw when we saw that survey, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but there really seemed to be 5 areas that sort of popped out based on that survey. And one was succession planning or lack thereof. One was strategic planning versus business planning, and the difference between those two, which is significant. Attracting a diverse board, I think that's something that all of us, and I can speak as a CEO of a nonprofit, I can empathize with how difficult that can be, depending upon what your criteria is. Maximizing the value of board meetings, particularly as we've moved out of the Zoom world and we're getting people back together, really making sure that that time that we're spending is well spent and engaging, and then enhancing board engagement. And you'll note that the last 3 are asterisked, and that's because we will be, I'm going to sort of talk a lot about the first 2, but then we will really go into some group think and some interactive group conversations about those last 3, so you won't have to put up with me the entire time. Okay, so going next. Again, just a little bit deeper, summary responses. What was very interesting there was when we talked about board diversity, we asked, what is your definition of board diversity? And it was really encouraging to see how wide, the breadth of that. That so many of you are going beyond what we had sort of traditionally identified as diversity, which could be racial or ethnic or gender, and really moving into sort of strategic, the board as strategic partners for whatever your mission is, and deciding how to really expand the definition of diversity. Very few of you said you had a succession plan. Some said that you didn't. Some said you didn't, but you wanted to have one. And some said, kind of working on it. So we thought that succession planning could really be a good topic as we're diving deep into governance, because succession planning is really a key piece of good governance. Strategic plan. it was very encouraging. You all said, yes, we got a strategic plan. And then the next question was, how often do you review it? And when we saw 2 months, monthly, every meeting, we thought, that isn't a strategic plan. That's an operations plan. They're both very important, but they are very different. And the role of board versus staff in a strategic plan versus an operations plan is really a key differential. So he said, yes, you have one, but do you really? So we're going to talk about that a little bit and see if maybe we can flesh out some of those differences. In the board meetings, a lot of feedback about, or frustration, I should say, about not feeling as though the board members are all that engaged in the board meeting, and maybe talking about some tips that we could all collectively come together on that might help drive that engagement, not just for board meetings, but also board engagement generally. So again, it was your responses that really helped drive this agenda. So I hope that it's meaningful. Please let me know if you can't hear me. We don't have any microphones. I was told in the last meeting the room was a little different, that I was somewhat hard to hear. So I certainly don't want that to be the case. So if you can't hear me, just raise your hand and tell me that my voice is dropping or I'm talking too fast or something, because it's a small enough group that. And I also want to make sure that that as we're moving through this, particularly in the first several sections on strategic planning and on strategic and operations planning, please feel free to ask questions. We will have Q&A time at the end. But if you want to stop me, it's such an intimate group. Let's just stop and talk. The other thing I just want to point out is, and Chris and team did a great job of putting these folders together. One feedback, we got great feedback from the last session on Western Slope, so I hope the same value will be realized today. But one good suggestion that we had, which was a change, is that these slides are in your packet. So, feel free to, I hope you don't read ahead, because then it'll be all spoiler. And, oh, I just thought of something. We shouldn't have put some of those in there. But anyway, we'll talk later. Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay. But anyway, so, if you, no need to take copious notes unless you really want to. Also, I know that they will also have this, they'll be sending it out, and it'll be on their board, and on their website too. So hopefully we can just dialogue rather than have to take a lot of notes. Okay, so with that, I want to ask Chris just to do a little recap of one of the topics that was covered in the first session, because it's pretty fundamental to what we're going to be talking about today. I advanced it for you.
Thank you. This is the overview of the different board types. This was covered in the beginning governance class, but I do think it's important to give a short overview here of what these different types are and what they mean. And that's probably a little hard to read. It's definitely hard to read on your screen. But the gist of it is a working board is generally where a nonprofit is going to start out, right? These are board members who are doing all of the work. They're as Kathy knows, they're volunteer boards, right? They run the programs, they advance the mission of the organization, they do all of the fundraising. They are focused on keeping the lights on and keeping things running. That is really where nonprofits start, unless you happen to get very, very lucky and have a massive amount of funding. You can start some big nonprofit with staff, because that's another component of working boards. Typically they have few to very little staff, or no staff at all, to do any of that day-to-day work. The next level up is a governing board. And now they may still be getting their hands dirty in doing some of the working, but usually they have, at this point, some paid staff that are doing the work, that are moving the mission forward of the organization, that are running the programs. And at this point, the governing board is typically, the board members are, they're driving policy, they are implementing procedures, and they are taking over that fiduciary oversight and that oversight in general of the organization, as opposed to the day-to-day routine of the organization. And then the pinnacle is that strategic and visionary board. Now, these are boards where the board members are looking 5-10 years down the road and envisioning where they want the organization to end up, in the long term. These are typically going to be boards where there are always paid staff. The Eldorado Community Foundation is a really good example of a board that has a visionary and strategic board. Our board doesn't do any work. Aside from I take that back. They do a lot of work, but they aren't doing the day-to-day work of the foundation. We have staff for that. This is where every organization wants to get to. Again, it's the pinnacle. But the roles that are taken on by these board members aren't necessarily static. Their roles are going to oscillate between working, governing, and strategic and visioning at all of the points in the spectrum. But one thing that is consistent throughout is going to be their need to maintain avoidance of liability for themselves and for the organizations. A lot of that comes down to that fiduciary oversight, but there's other things that, there's other factors that come into play there. The classic example is the one that Bill loves to give, and I would give you an example from my own experience, but I haven't served on any boards, so I don't have any. Not yet. I'm sure that's not an invitation. But Bill's example that he likes to give is he served on a board in a city that I won't name, Sacramento, where
not Sacramento.
No, not Sac Regional Community Foundation, but one of the programs involved adults working with children, and he asked a question in a board meeting: are these adults, have they gone through the screening process with the DOJ and been fingerprinted and all of that? And the answer was no. And this program had been running for a good 6 months. And he said to them right then and there, if that doesn't change, I have to resign. I can't take on the liability, the personal liability of that. And that's something that board members need to realize and understand, is that they do take on the liability of what the organization is doing, whether it be fiduciary liability or other like that. They aren't just there as a warm body filling in a seat and getting free lunch and free coffee. They're there for guidance, and they definitely take on that liability. So with that,
I was going to say, and you should make sure that you have board insurance as well.
oh yes, D&O insurance is definitely important for any organization to have. That is a very important question if you serve on any board, to ask of the board. Do we have D&O insurance? With that overview given, show of hands, how many of you currently serving on, or your organization has what you would call a working board?
I'm working for it.
And same for governing board. All right. And how about strategic and visionary boards? Any of those here? Okay. Just one. Still a decent mix. So, but that really goes to show that, and I saw some hands even go up twice, and that really goes to show that even if you are one, you're still occupying the roles of the other. You may be in a transitional period, or you may just be in a situation where you don't have staff to cover everything. You've got staff to cover some things, but not everything. So with that, I think it's back to you, Linda.
Okay. So we're going to just launch into succession planning here. Now, I just want to, based on what I saw from show of hands, it sounds as though there is a mixture of different types of boards. But having some type of succession planning, or at least awareness of succession planning, is really important for all organizations. And one could argue that actually it may be even more important in smaller organizations, where a change in leadership really could be hugely disruptive, particularly if it's unplanned. So I'm going to go through a number of different sort of considerations to think about, but overarching considerations is the plan should cover both planned and unplanned vacancies. So thinking about senior staff, if you have it, particularly someone like a CFO or a director of finance, somebody who runs your audit, making sure that there's some bench strength there if the organization is supporting that level. There should always be, regardless of the size of the organization, board involvement and succession planning. The other thing is, do you want succession planning for DED or senior staff or both? And that is often very, very size dependent, depending upon if you do have paid staff. And then what does the search process look like? Larger organizations, may have the ability to go hire a search firm and do a very broad-based search. Not everybody's going to be that way, but one of the first questions is, do you have any internal bench strength that you could be cultivating should there be a change in leadership? Or should you be looking externally? Again, a lot of size-dependent considerations.
This makes me think, because succession planning being an all-volunteer organization, both our board and our work, our what we call navigators, volunteer navigators, you think of succession planning as, who's going to replace Jude, that there's always somebody in the wings. But in my mind, I'm also thinking as our organization grows that the succession will be the day that comes that we do start to bring on certain strategic positions, paid positions that may be part-time to start out with. So in a way, there's succession planning even if you're not there with anyone to succeed.
That's a great point. So it's really sort of your strategic growth, but also recognizing that you've got to be just like if you're out there thinking who would be a good replacement for ED. Also, sort of surveying your landscape about who, and as we grow, what kind of person and profile should we be cultivating in the region. So excellent point.
So you're talking about succession planning staff. What about if you're just all the working board, just board members, and your succession planning would be for new board members?
Yes, and we were going to talk about including new board members too. Maybe not so much as part of the succession planning, but I know but I want to make sure that this is relevant to all sizes. There's no question that this is what we're going to talk about really represents a pretty comprehensive plan that has a lot of elements to it. It assumes that there's an executive committee. It assumes that maybe the executive committee can hand off some of the sort of tasks to other board members to help with onboarding and Thrive and search and all that. But again, just think about sort of collapsing it so that if it's only can be an executive committee or it can only be the board, still just thinking about what considerations should we be thinking about. So how many of you have an executive committee? Okay. So in that instance, and again, I'm going to talk about executive committee here, but think of it as maybe just a board, okay? So the executive committee typically will serve as the governing body, so it ends up to be the board as well, for both planned and unplanned successions. They may appoint other committees, as I said, if applicable, but that again will be very size dependent. And they should, and again, I'm just going to refer to the executive committee generically here, should oversee the annual review of the plan. And so it's a heavy lift to do a plan, but then it's worth that, because then what you end up doing is just having to review it annually as part of your board or your executive committee job descriptions. So the review should always look at the traits and characteristics of the ideal ED or board member at the time of the review. Have in mind, to your point, ma'am, that the potential interim ED candidates also staff candidates, to the point you made earlier, at the time of the review. And the reason that that is important to be doing annually is that the market could change. The organization could have gotten a very large gift that might have changed its footprint. It may have had a funding challenge going the other way, that where the new ED may need to be more of a steward than a strategic grower, if you get my drift there. You would also need to know if a search firm or a process for selecting a consultant, if you can do a search firm, who, and this is something to be thinking about ahead of time, if you're thinking about a new ED or a new finance person, who in the community, what stakeholders should be interviewed, including key members of the community or your funders, whomever, to help with identifying what that ED, that new ED should, what kind of expertise they should have. And then develop a budget related to search and replacement, because no matter what size you are, there will be budgetary constraints to this and budgetary ramifications. So when you're putting together a budget every year, don't forget to think about maybe some contingent budgeting that might have to, and hopefully you'll never, you won't have to use it from year to year, but have, if you can, some contingent budget that could cover the costs of a search.
Just on that,
Yeah.
I think also what is useful, particularly if you're a board member, is actually knowing what the market is in terms of salary. So, unfortunately in Boys and Girls Club of America, for a time there was a huge turnover of CEOs. From the kind of new CEO class that I went to, I was the only one left like a year later.
Wow.
It's tough work. And one of the big pushes in Boys and Girls Club of America to try and keep CEOs was, you're right, the cost of recruitment, but then also, actually getting candidates, and what you have to pay them. So it's much better to retain your CEO than have to go out to the market,
Right.
where you're probably going to end up paying a lot more.
That's great.
Especially relevant in South Lake Tahoe, the cost of living is significantly higher than the rest of El Dorado County.
And for anybody doing, salary negotiations, it's like, well, it would cost you a lot to replace me.
And that's particularly true, I think, as with we had the inflation and remote work, and I mean, all the dynamics of so many of our organizations really changed, and certainly compensation was one of them.
And I think we don't do a good job of actually sharing that kind of information. I know you can look on GuideStar or whatever, but I was telling Bill that someone in the community approached me recently to ask me what my salary was, because Bill is doing succession planning, and I do think that's important.
Yeah.
We need to share that information more.
Yeah. It's a great point, and so please make a note of that. I think we do talk about market conditions later, but it can't be overlooked. It's a great point. The other thing when you're thinking about sort of the board role, again, whether it's executive committee or board, is will the ED job be the same in the future as is today? And again, that can be dependent upon funding sources, be dependent upon the role of the board. It can be dependent upon your strategic plan if you have one. And is the leadership model still valid? What are the organizational issues, and what does the future look like? And that again underscores the importance of a strategic plan, and what skills are necessary. And I would add there, skills and compensation requirements are necessary. What needs to be included in the transition plan to apprise the stakeholders of the transition. So one thing I think that is really sometimes overlooked, and again I think this is true regardless of your size, is that if your organization is going through change, whether it be growth, whether it be leadership change, whether you're starting to evolve from all volunteer to, hey, whatever your evolution is, whatever your position is, don't forget to communicate it to your key stakeholders. Because what you don't want your stakeholders to think is that things are in some sort of chaos, even if it's good chaos. Explain, make sure that you're very transparent about what's going on in the organization and that this is good change. This is hopefully planned change. That's really true if it's unplanned change, but we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then it's also important to develop an offboarding process for the departing executive. And what I mean by that is, and I can speak from very recent experience, having just left the Sacramento Regional Community Foundation, we spent a lot of time talking about my role as I was handing off, and sort of what, and if there's crossover, when does the new executive director really start to become the face of the organization, and when does the departing leader sort of ride off into the sunset? Turned out, in my case, it was really simple, thank God, because we did do a very large search, but an internal candidate was hired. So all of my sleepless nights about, geez, whoever's hired is going to look at my filing system and think, how did this organization not just crumble? Well, luckily, the person that was hired knew all my flaws, so that was good. But we did have a very specific plan on, particularly if there was someone who may not be associated with the organization or associated with the community foundation world. In our case, it may be the particular sector you're serving. Really think about how much time in a plan, succession plan, you don't forget the person leaving, for sure. Other roles that the executive committee or the board committee would, and this again is very dependent on size, would to actually have a search committee. When we're going to talk later about board engagement, if you are lucky enough to have a big enough board, and I know, Bill, you said you have 23 or something crazy in my view. Anyway, if you're doing a big effort like this, try to engage other board members in this whole search process. So they could, if they're not on the executive committee, they could be on the search committee. They could be on what we call the Thrive Committee, which is developing and overseeing the onboarding for the new ED as opposed to the offboarding. So just something to think about, and again, acknowledging it's very size dependent. But the elements of this, I just want to keep going back to this, the elements of this, whether it's one person or a specific a committee or whatever, onboarding, search, offboarding, all in a plan transition, all of those elements are really important to a successful transition. So we've talked a little bit about this, but some other elements is in a plan succession. What is the? Oh, you want to ask a question?
Are you thinking mainly retirement here, not someone going and getting a new job?
Well, that would probably be unplanned. Okay, so I mean, typically an unplanned may have a much shorter transition. So we'll talk a bit about unplanned in a minute, but this really would be someone who said, okay, I'm like Bill, or like I did. I'm intending to leave the organization in X amount of time. If in a planned succession, that ideally should be, and I'm talking now to the CEOs and EDs in the room, that should be at least 6 months. Again, budget considerations, need to think about that. There should be a launch. Again, this is all communicating, all this being very transparent to your stakeholders, a work plan. And you can read all these. I don't need to read them all, but looking at your initiatives, looking at your overview of your programs. This is a great time to look at also at the state of your technology systems. Because if someone's coming in, you don't want to think, well, I'm still using, if I don't have to, I don't use computers or something. I mean, this is a time to really think, how can we evaluate the state of the organization? And this is also a great time to make sure that your policies and procedures are up to date. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about an example where policies and procedures were not up to date when there was an unplanned succession or unplanned departure. But even if it's planned, what you don't want is a new ED coming in and they're looking at bylaws that haven't been updated since 2010.
When would you say you go public? Because thinking about it, particularly small nonprofits.
Yep.
So much of the trust when it comes to grants and donors
Right.
is the leadership. So when would you actually, it says minimum of 6 months, but I would worry that, I might miss out on some grants in that time.
I wouldn't go, in a small nonprofit, I wouldn't go public in 6 months. But a 6-month internal planning process to start looking at your policies and procedures, figure out what your search is going to be. Maybe look at, if you're in the midst of a budgeting cycle, if the old ED is leaving in the middle of a budgeting cycle, maybe you want to change your budgeting cycle just for that year. I mean, so those, because why would, if you want to walk in on if you're a new leader and you walk in and all of a sudden they say, okay, so sit down and do the budget. And again, in a small organization, that could be difficult. So I think it really depends upon the organization, but that's why a communications plan, and I think I talk about that here, is communication with stakeholders. That needs to be part of the plan for the very reason that you're talking about. If it's a large organization, and like for instance with the Community Foundation, where you've got all these fund holders, you do not want to have fund holders thinking that the organization is in some way, shape, or form unstable, right? Because they've invested in long-term philanthropy with the foundation. So I know that the El Dorado Community Foundation is, Bill's been very transparent about some of his plans.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep, and I'll talk about some
Yeah.
of that more as well.
Yeah. But you're right. I think when there's a smaller organization that is looking at, grants, and certainly any good grant application is going to talk about leadership. Transparency is important, but it doesn't have to be as soon as 6 months. I think it's very size dependent. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it's very size dependent.
Just a thought on that is, it seems to me that you ought to be communicating that with your grantors before you announce the position announcement.
Right, yeah.
So they don't get surprised.
Yeah.
Right.
And that sort of sends the message, we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think you're right, it's just, until you're ready to put the announcement out,
Yeah.
you sort of keep it close,
Yeah.
but you gotta let them know a little bit ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's the whole thing about communication with stakeholders and a communications plan. There really needs to be a communications plan around any planned leadership succession. And that plan would identify those key stakeholders. The plan would identify, when the key stakeholders know, when the public announcement is made, how they're gonna, who's gonna be the spokesperson, all of that, so that but the whole idea is to, if you have the luxury of a planned leadership change, be as thoughtful as you can possibly be about the communication of it. I think is what we're all saying here. Yeah.
I think another thing I see is that a lot of times when someone announces they're leaving, it comes this pause on decision making, and we can't make that plan move forward, or we can't do this because that person, we want to wait for the new person to come on.
Right.
And so I was curious if you could comment on that as well, because that's something I've seen a lot, that it also for the employees feels like things aren't moving forward, or that we have, they want to wait for the vision of the next person or decisions from that.
Well, I think the one big driver of trying to avoid that happening is the outgoing ED. I talked about the onboarding and the offboarding plan. I think an offboarding plan, in working with the board, should be what projects do we need to keep our front and center, we need to keep moving. And maybe there are projects that might be better managed by a new leader rather than somebody coming in the middle. Just to give an example of that, I'm going to keep bringing it back to myself, but I thought a lot about this for that very reason. As we were in the process of doing a pretty extensive diversity, equity, and inclusion plan for the foundation, for our operations, for our grant making, for our recruitment. And I didn't want that to stop I thought that was important regardless of who was going to succeed. So we had a plan, but what we then did is a roadmap on how to implement, because you're not going to implement all these DEI strategies overnight, right? So we wanted the plan to be ready, so that when the new CEO came in, he or she had a plan that they were responsible for executing. The exact same thing happened with strategic planning for us. I thought long and hard about should we postpone our strategic plan, talk to our board, consultant, et cetera. And we decided no, that we were going to go ahead and put together the plan in 2022, which obviously did have some activities associated with it, of course. It was a 5-year plan. But the plan was something that then the new CEO could actually implement, put his or her stamp on, maybe challenge if they thought there was elements to it that weren't necessarily appropriate. But the thought was, I knew the region, I knew organization, our staff was involved in so many parts of this. There was no reason just to stop. And so I guess that, I mean, going back to your question a little bit more directly, I would encourage not stopping, to the degree that you can lay the groundwork for someone to come in and implement. I think that's actually a gift to the new leader. There may be instances where laying the groundwork would be a problem for a new leader, but I would ask that question internally. Is this a gift that we can hand to the new leader so that they can then go ahead and implement? And not use a change in leadership as an excuse to be paralyzed.
Yeah.
Because that's also going to show up with your stakeholders. If all of a sudden it looks like the El Dorado Community Foundation is like, they're not doing these things anymore because Bill's leaving, or they're not having their annual dinner because Bill's leaving, or they're not going on with some of the wonderful stuff I was hearing about, job fairs and things that are going on. The best thing to do, if you know you're going to be in a leadership change, is have business as usual so that it doesn't telegraph that you're worried about this leadership change, you as an organization.
Something else to note on that, just to help kind of add on to this is where the board should probably be stepping forward too. If there's a change of leadership that's coming, that's a really good time for the board to step forward and start making some of the decisions that if there is that decision paralysis, the board can keep that moving forward, because the board is still going to be there after the ED leaves and the new ED comes on. So
that's a good point. Questions? And if I think I'm on the right side. Yeah. So no, I'm not. So again, when we're talking about a key element, the search process again can be a big search process that's run by a consultant, if you have the budget to do that, or it can be run by a small part of a volunteer board. But it should be, this is an opportunity again to really put together a description of what it is that you're looking for, whether it's a new senior staff person, whether it's new board members, in this case, whether it's a new CEO. The really thinking about, if I could write the script for who is the best CEO I could find. Now's the time to do that. And then again, the marketing plan, you see this all through this thing. Marketing plan, communication plan, for the very reasons that we've talked about, is just to really make sure that you're not telegraphing chaos. And then the offer negotiations, and this is where you get to the the salary issues. When you're putting together the position plan or the position guide, that's where you need to make sure that you have some awareness of your market and what the salary requirements are. One thing that I think you may or may not have heard is that California has recently passed a law that has required that whenever you post a job, you have to post a salary range, which you know, I understand why some people thought that was a good idea. I'm not making a political statement here. But I also know that that could also, that you know, there's a chance that in doing that, it could disrupt your whole salary structure of your organization.
So
But
Molly
you
is
also
doing all our compliance. So
What?
we just make the actual salary we want to give the top
Yeah.
of the range.
Yeah.
So then people think they're coming in at the high end.
But what about the rest of your staff?
We also,
make the compliments.
yeah, we've also put in our employee handbook the salary ranges for all positions, so it's all transparent.
Okay. So wait a minute, what'd you say? So you publish the top salary?
Yeah, so for example, we've got summer program leaders out there right now. So we put the range at 20 to 23, and we're going to hire them at 23.
Oh, I see. So you do the range though. You do the range. Okay, that's the piece I missed. Yeah, the range is important. But I also, you know, you also may have some other people in your organization that might feel, well, wait a minute, you know, they're going to come in at the same level I am. I've been here 5 years. And I think that's why those who drafted this thought it was a good idea, because there should be pay equity. And there shouldn't be just be pay equity based on tenure. It should be equity, as we know, based on gender, based on, you know, all kinds of reasons that there should be equity. And making sure that, you know, it's published sort of forces an organization's hand if they are not so inclined to be transparent about that with their staff. Sounds like you guys are.
I was wondering actually, is it something the foundation would be interested in capturing? Is that the data of kind of, you know, budget size and salaries? So that then, you know, rather than people having to go and ask the individual, you know, they could go to the foundation and be like, hey, can we get, you know, what is the current lay of the land in Elmore County?
It's an interesting thought. Let's talk more about that. I like that idea. That's a good thought.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just came out of the chamber world, and Cal Chamber has a survey that they send out every year so they can capture that, and they can narrow it down to your organization size and what the average is. And Western Association of Chambers also does that, so you could compare it regionally to Arizona or whatnot, and it's very valuable.
For the Eldorado Community Foundation, whenever we do look at salaries and salary ranges, we go to the business world. We don't go to the nonprofit world, because one of the big things for us is that, you know, excellence is expensive. I'm sure you've all heard Bill say that before, and if you haven't, well, what rock have you been hiding under? But excellence is expensive, and if you're going to hire staff at what our current nonprofit rates, you might not get the kind of quality people that you need to get. So,
to that point, not the business world, which could be sort of a chamber thing, but for the community foundation world, and it sounds like this can be very sector specific. There's an organization called the League of California Community Foundations, and they actually do a survey as well based on asset size. So that you know, for all key senior leadership positions, which is really helpful. And we used that when I was leaving. And you have to adjust, knowing that, you know, somebody in LA may, you know, the cost of living may be a little different than Sacramento, but it does give you a range, and it is by asset size. So that really does, you know, acknowledge that different size organizations can, you know, have to be sensitive to what they can afford. On the nonprofit world, though, there is, have you all heard of Cal Nonprofits? Okay. Cal Nonprofits, I believe, they used to anyway, it does a salary survey. So I haven't,
I believe they still do.
They still do, yeah. We recently purchased it,
Okay.
and it's wonderful. It breaks it down by region, asset, number of employees.
Okay.
It's incredible.
Yeah, that
So
was
if
good.
anybody wants to look at it, we have a copy. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's a good one, and that is based on the
We
nonprofit world, though.
provided.
But at least you could use that as a
Yeah.
you know, a guide,
Yeah, it's-
if not. Yeah, so there are, I think the Impact Foundry as well does some salary analysis in this region. But the Cal Nonprofit one is probably
It's
the
really
most comprehensive. I'm glad they're still doing it. For some reason, I just didn't see one recently, so I'm glad. That's good to know. This next slide, I don't know that we need to go through it. I've kind of touched on it. as, you know, so sort of the last key elements of thinking about planned departure, about to go into unplanned departure. But just this offboarding and onboarding, remembering that both of those elements are important, so that the new ED feels briefed and supported, and the outgoing ED doesn't feel like they've been kicked to the curb, right? So, all right. Going into emergency ED succession, and this could be, you know, someone is ill, someone is leaving and hasn't really given much notice, right? So we're calling it emergency, but it could also just as easily be called unplanned. I'm sorry, let me change that. So if you have an executive committee, if not your board, really needs to kind of step in this case and look at if there is a senior management team, who would be responsible for daily operations, and then what are the primary functions that in an unplanned departure really need to be, that are critical to be covered. And you also need to define a definition of vacancy. So if somebody's saying, I'm going off to take a new job, and I'm giving you 30 days notice. Well, you know at that point that you need to really kick into an active hiring phase, right? But if somebody says, I am, you know, unplanned illness, I don't know if I'll be back in a month or I'll be back in 2 months. You start, in your plan, you start to need to have sort of what happens at different levels of vacancy. A vacancy of 90 to 120 days may require somebody to come in as an interim CEO and having some ideas of who those people should be, or a senior board person, having some ideas to be able to react to an emergency is important. And also you should identify triggers, because depending upon what you do, what the role of your organization, you may not be able to go 120 days, right? So you should identify in your plan, is it as a trigger 15 days that we need to go out and start hunting for an interim? Is it 120 days? I think it just really depends on your board structure. Do you have senior staff that can step in? Do you have some local contacts that you know could be a good source of leadership for you while you're then doing a succession plan? The other thing about emergency is really key. We talked about it, but communication. And so you'll see the first thing here about the primary function, spokesperson, communications, external presence, and how that authority is being delegated.
I was just wondering, would this aspect work as well, you know, when you know the ED's coming back? So classic being maternity.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I do think to myself, you know, if something happens to my parents and I had to go to the UK,
right,
I'm not going to be gone a week.
Right.
So do you address that differently, or?
Yeah, so emergency could be a planned emergency, for lack of a, which sounds crazy, but knowing that someone is coming back. But if you said, I'm not going to be back for 5 months, that might carry with it some different concerns from the board than if you said, I'm going to be gone for 30 days. And that's where these triggers really are very organization dependent. If you're very visible, if you've got, you know, if you've got a large organization, or you're very much involved in the running of the organization as a board member, that's where you really need to, but you should be thinking about, the whole point is, you should be anything to do with this should be in a plan. So that when it does happen, and we know that it will happen, whether it's, again, personal family issues, whether it's health issues, or whether it's hi, I just got a great job and I'm leaving in 2 weeks, rather than everybody running around like, oh my God, it should be in this plan. It should be in your plan, but specifically triggered to who your size, and therefore the amount of time you think you can manage a vacancy. The other question, any questions on that? The other thing that some plans cover, and it's not always appropriate, If you are in a smaller organization, but, and again, I'm going to use the word emergency absence of senior staff, but for instance, maternity leave could be, quote, a planned emergency. It's not an emergency, it's a wonderful thing. But you want to make sure that your organization is prepared for it. So what you would do as part of your plan is identify in advance who would step in for that senior staff person. And I think typically 60 days and beyond, and again, always can change by size, but 60 days and beyond is probably as much as you want to have senior staff with on, without having some, not just asking other people to cover for them. Because that's asking somebody, do 2 jobs for 2 months. That's a lot to ask. So one idea that I implemented is to ask all the staff, every staff member, senior, not senior, board, to have a list of at least 3 to 4 people that they would hire for their position. They don't have to tell me who it is. Stick it in your desk. But think about it, refresh it. So that if there was this emergency absence or even a planned absence and you wanted to hire somebody temporary or whatever, you're asking the person who knows their job the very best, and it doesn't have to be senior staff in this instance either. You're asking the person who knows their job the very best, who out there could step in to what I'm doing and cause the least amount of disruption.
So, Boys and Girls Club of Western Nevada lost their CEO kind of suddenly. She didn't die, she's left. And actually, they got the Reno Boys and Girls Club to come and run them while they searched for a new ED, which is interesting. And I didn't know if that was also something, as a community, kind of leaning on each other, for some of that help, where you don't have the depth of staff who can perhaps step up.
Well, I think that would be a great thing to have in a plan. I mean, I hate to sound so flip on that, but and just think about, I don't know if they were, if they did have a plan, Western Nevada, if they did have a plan. But I bet there was a lot of scrambling going on.
Yeah.
If they had a plan where Reno and Western Nevada may have had sort of a mutual an agreement in advance, that should we have a disruption, could we rely on each other? Think how much more, I would assume, much more a whole calmer thing, and getting back to donors, grantees, et cetera, the communication plan could have been instigated like that. So it just goes back to, I'm sounding like a broken record, and I literally am gonna shut up now about this, is the plan. And having a plan and the size, just the elements that are relevant that you could incorporate. Do it once, it takes time, but then every year pick it up and look at it and say what is no longer valid, what assumptions were we making, when we did this that may have changed, and again, always looking at your policies and procedures as part of succession planning. And it really does come down to a key piece of nonprofit governance. So I'm going to talk real quickly, kind of a fun thing, about the examples of the importance of succession planning. Now, I'm going to let Chris talk about what's done right.
Let's start with wrong.
Right.
That's more fun.
So I'm saying the YOLO Food Bank, it is now up and running and humming like a great machine. I'm going to talk about what happened there. I'm not talking out of school. All of this was in the press, but it's a perfect example. So there was a very, very active CEO at the YOLO Food Bank. Very politically active, trying to, particularly with the pandemic, working with local politicians, getting a lot of art money, all kinds of things coming in. He got so active that some of the local Pauls didn't didn't really like what he was doing, and that he was sort of alienating people, right? So they went to the board, and the board also knew that he was kind of going rogue, and they dismissed him. They didn't have a plan. And if they had a plan, one of the things, if they had done it right, one of the things they would have done, if you remember I said, use the plan as an excuse to always look at your policies and procedures and your bylaws and so forth, so that whomever's coming in, you know, is coming into a current organization. The outgoing ED is suing the YOLO Food Bank because he says, and I think he's right, that the bylaws were so old that the term limits for board meetings, for board membership, weren't being followed. And therefore, a certain number of board members who voted
You got locked out.
a certain number of board members who voted to dismiss him were not legitimately not part of the board because they hadn't updated, they hadn't checked their bylaws, they hadn't updated their bylaws to accommodate a longer term if they wanted these folks to stay on the board. So therefore, they had no standing to fire the guy. Yikes. So I don't know where it stands. I know that he's suing the food bank and he's suing those board members who had no right to terminate him. That's crazy. If they had a succession plan, all would be good. Luckily, they hired a great woman, Karen Baker, to come in, and again, YOLO Food Bank is well on its way to becoming a completely cohesive again. But for a while there, it was ugly.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was it part of his responsibility to make sure they had a good succession plan?
Well, yes, but ultimately it is the role of the board to make sure that there is a succession plan, and we talked about it in the board, the visionary and strategic board identified succession planning, but I would argue, not to disagree too much with these guys, but I would argue that thinking ahead about how a succession plan is important for every board, even volunteer boards. And even more important perhaps for volunteer boards where it could be such a huge disruption. So yeah, it is ultimately the sustainability of the organization and the financial health of the organization is what the board is ultimately tasked with. And the sustainability of an organization has to include its leadership. So, and also has to include its compliance. So compliance with bylaws, compliance with financial standards, compliance with law. Now the board can say to staff, if they've got that luxury, go update them and let us approve them. But ultimately, the responsibility sits with the board. Okay, so somebody that's doing it right.
Perfect. So, so as all of you probably know at this point, the El Dorado Community Foundation is in the process of a succession plan because Bill is retiring. I mean, he's only almost 70, so I think he's earned it at this point. So I'm going to talk about three components, three elements of this succession plan, and that's the timeline, the internal processes, and the external processes and why they're important. So as far as the timeline goes, the clock on this really started about two and a half years ago when Bill informed the then board that when the current, now current president of the board, Katie Peak, termed off. Now we do three consecutive 3-year terms, so 9-year terms on the board. So this year will be her last year. Then she'll actually be on for another year as past president before officially fully terming off. But this is the point at which Bill said he wanted to retire and basically go out with Katie Peak, who's the founder, as we all found out during the trivia, of the foundation. So kind of poetic in that sense. But the conversation really started 2 years ago when he told me that. And that was a good amount of time for them to really kind of get their head around the concept of life without Bill and what the future of the foundation is going to look like without Bill, who's been there for 16 years. So the foundation that Bill inherited 16 years ago is a vastly different foundation than the foundation today, in terms of size, in terms of community awareness, assets, yeah, everything. In terms of the amount of staff we have, so it's pretty night and day. So having that long buffer period for the board to kind of come to terms with this has been really good. So this last January, things really kicked off with the board having a board retreat, their annual retreat, where they discussed everything related to the succession. And a good amount of what they discussed was, what are we looking for? Who do we want? What kind of person do we want? What qualities do we want them to have? What qualifications? And then there was a bit of building out of what the actual succession timeline was going to look like. And that is, the announcement comes in late spring, early summer of this year. The announcement includes a request for letters of interest to apply. So all of those letters of interest will come into the succession planning committee, who consists of the current executive committee, so the president, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and past president. And also sitting on the succession planning committee is Bill himself. Not because he put himself there, but because they requested he be part of the search committee. And the incoming vice president, who was actually really asked to rejoin the board for the purposes of heading up the succession planning committee. And that individual is Paul Zapatini, who I'm sure a lot of you probably are familiar with, especially Kathy Lishby from Westlope is definitely going to be familiar with Paul. Paul's been a fund holder and part of the foundation for a long time. So, and he served on the board prior as well. So this is going to be his second of 3 consecutive 3-year terms. So that committee is going to be receiving those letters of interest to apply, and then they're going to be going through them and inviting those that they feel would be qualified applicants to apply and ask for applications. Those applications will then come in through the summer, and they'll be evaluated by the succession planning committee and by the board, and they will invite those that they find worth pursuing to actually take part in the interview process, which will initially be with the executive committee, rather the succession planning committee, and then again with the whole board. And those interviews should take place in November, and then an individual will be chosen in sometime in December to start on January 1st. And there will be some overlap that Bill will still be part of the foundation, and a lot of that concern was at the beginning of the year, the foundation is going through an audit. We're closing the books for the previous year. We send out, year-end statements, and Bill is, or the executive director rather, is a component in all of those things. And is it really fair to ask the new ED to be responsible for those things of which they weren't even part of the previous year? So Bill will continue on for that, and also to ease the transition. The board has also asked Bill to stay on retainer, to which he responded, that sounds a whole lot like employment. but he understands the need and will remain at least with that toe in the door for a period of time, in the event that he needs to step back in if something doesn't work out with the new executive director, or for whatever reason, consulting reasons or what have you. But that transition should take place over the course of at maximum 6 months, probably less, depending on how quickly the new ED picks things up. So that's the timeline. Now, internally, to prepare for all of this, we're going through the process of, as Linda mentioned, policies several times. Policies are all getting updated. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're changing things in the policies. Some of them are getting changed and updated where it's necessary. Some of them are not, but they are all going back before the board for approval, because the last thing we want is to have a new ED come in, look at a policy that's dated, 2009, and say, why hasn't this policy been looked at and, approved by the board for over a decade? So that's an internal process we're going through. Another internal process that we're going through is Bill is working to download his institutional knowledge onto the current donor services coordinator. So there's a lot of backstory to all the fund holders and the donors of the foundation, some of whom aren't even with us anymore. But all of that knowledge, that 16 years of knowledge that he has, is just going to go away and disappear if he doesn't transfer that knowledge to somebody. So he's in the process with Hillary, who's sitting in the back, of going through each of the funds and transferring all of that knowledge to her, so that she knows, what the stories are, because that's so much of what's important with the funds of the foundation. These are opened by individuals who, sorry?
I think,
Go for it.
I think that's great. I think that should be done for the last 16 years, right?
Right.
Is that kind of like what's ideal, is to continue to share that knowledge? And I think it's an old, I find that the kind of not spreading knowledge is kind of an old thought of like, oh no, if this person knows my information, I'm in jeopardy of being fired, or that I am not as valuable as an employee. And I think there is definitely a shift we're seeing of having a more collaborative share of knowledge.
And the foundation's always been that way.
Yeah.
And definitely we are very transparent with our knowledge. The reason it's happening now with Hillary just took on the role of donor services coordinator. We had Lois Roberts, who retired this last year. So, and he had done all of that with her prior. But it's important that it now be transferred over to Hillary, since she is in that role of donor services coordinator.
I just want to point out that I think it's a really good strategy for strategic planning is to always, or sorry, succession planning is to always have that sharing of knowledge and making sure that another person can do your job.
Absolutely.
So I was going to ask, is Wendy David or someone from Tahoe on the hiring committee? Because as you said, like, knowledge is really interesting, and I know. So I applied for my job a year before I actually got it. Second application I got it. And the board expressed to me one of the concerns initially was, I didn't know Boys and Girls Clubs, and although I had lived locally, I had never worked locally. And so, I personally, I didn't think that mattered, but we are a pretty unique community. So and obviously we do have the two sides, and sometimes they meet and sometimes they don't. And so how much is kind of local knowledge of El Dorado County coming into play, and how much is private foundation work? And personally, I'm not wedded to either of those things, but was just interested.
Wendy is not on the succession planning committee, and there is not actually a representative from Tahoe on the succession planning committee.
Ooh.
I know. That is a question that has been raised, and I do believe that Bill is taking that back to the succession planning committee to see if that's a consideration that they want to go. But ultimately, it is up to them.
Would you consider, and I'm not looking for a job, would you consider someone who lived up here, or are you going to ask them to be in-house in Mexico?
I think it's, so I know that the net is being cast very wide. It isn't being limited to Western Slope or even El Dorado County.
Okay.
We're going to be looking and casting the net everywhere. Statewide, countrywide.
I'm guessing it won't be remote work.
Oh, no, it definitely will not. That's not a role that can be performed remote. You absolutely have to have personal interface in that role.
So they're going to be moving.
Oh, yeah, if it was somebody from, and that's actually another component to that budget that needs to be taken into consideration. If somebody needs to relocate for a succession,
we really ran into that last year, actually hiring for Molly's position, because, it was, we advertised it with Boys and Girls Club of America. I had a ton of folks applying from Iowa and Illinois. And I think they were attracted by the salary. And then I said, please look up our housing costs, and they all rescinded
Yeah.
their applications.
Yeah, and that's.
So it was a budget for you guys if you wanted to interview them, excuse me, but you know, you probably would have had to pay their, pay their costs, Zoom, okay, but then certainly their reload costs.
We weren't going to offer that, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's just something that needs to be considered in that budget,
Right.
is if we want to attract talent from far away, then those may be things that you need to consider paying for.
And I would just, not to harp on all of this, but it does bring up interesting things, and especially all volunteers that we're not, you know, succeeding an executive director at this point, but most recently at the Juvenile Treatment Center, they have a court school within that entity, so it's all overseen by Eldorado Office of Education, and they really have a challenge, not so much that people aren't interested in that position as qualified teachers, because a lot of them have to have a special education background to take on that position. They end up bringing people on, and not only is it's a combination of finding a place to be able to afford even at a good wage, but living in an environment in the snow when you thought it would all just be wonderful and fun, I mean they're looking at, and I don't know how they're doing it, but they're really kind of screening people that are either already here or have already made plans in place to relocate here. And I thought that was interesting because they just struggled with that. Unfortunately, they have good, strong substitutes, but it same kind of thing, that they're applying from Illinois and wherever, and it sounds just like paradise to come from.
That would be quite a culture shock for anybody coming from
Chris Proctor was really interesting, that he told me, even doctors are looking at the cost of living up here, and I'm like, well, doctors, oh my goodness, we're in trouble.
I think I heard that as well. Sorry. Yeah. So go ahead.
Just a thought, if you're offering the job in December and they're starting January 1st, then that makes another organization that they're coming from have to have an emergency.
Well,
They better have a
certainly,
succession.
yeah, that's a good point. But that's
Hopefully
their
that
problem.
organization has a plan.
Exactly. For unplanned, yeah.
The unplanned is in the plan. That's what-
Exactly, that's the key.
Interview questions there is, can you drive in the snow?
It's probably smart, yeah, definitely. How are you with shovels? So then the last component that I want to talk about is the external. And the external is actually really fun because I'm a big part of that, since I do communication and PR for the foundation. So the foundation has spent, the past, since 1991, but especially with, under Bill, really trying to build the credibility of the foundation for the community, our donors, make sure that everybody trusts us and knows that we are a safe place for them to invest their money. Because it's really what we do is we invest in community, and it's donors investing their funds with the foundation in their community. So that trust and that confidence that they have in us is very, very important for us to maintain. So one of the things that we are doing, or will be doing soon, Bill will be beginning to have some of these conversations individually with some of our fund holders and donors, individuals who he has had relationships with for going on 16 years at this point, that he wants to make sure he can transfer that sense of trust that the foundation isn't changing. Bill is leaving, but the foundation itself is going to stay rock solid. And where I come into that is one of the things that I've been doing this past several months is, I don't know if all of you subscribe to the foundation's newsletter. If you don't, shame on you. But it's okay, you can sign up. So the newsletter, each one has featured a different board member and introducing those board members to the community. And so a big part of letting the community know that the foundation is rock solid is introducing them to those individuals who are members of the community who serve on our board, many of whom are well known and are respected figures throughout the community, because those individuals are going to still be here after Bill. And as soon as we're done with board members, which is very soon, I'm almost to my last one, those highlights are going to be on staff members that are not Bill. So myself, Kathy, Hillary, Sharon, and Sakina, our CPA, will all be featured in that same capacity to help the community get to know who we are. That's also going to be a theme in our annual report that's coming out here very soon for 2022, and it's going to have a section, or has a section, it's being printed right now, has a section on each one of us, introducing us, letting everybody know what we do for the foundation and what we accomplished in 2022, what we're excited about in 2023. So that way, individuals from the community, donors, fund holders know that they can come to us for things, not just Bill, who they may have come to in the past. Kathy Lishman is a good example of that. She just called me up yesterday with some questions about something that she thought I could help her out with, and I certainly can, and we'll meet about that tomorrow. But it's not just that transfer of knowledge that's internal, but it's that transfer of responsibility and that transfer of community trust from Bill, who's been there by far the longest. The next longest is our CPA at 6 years, me coming in at about 5, and then Kathy and Hillary and Sharon, who are significantly new to the foundation.
Hey, I'm 3.5.
Okay, 3.5, Kathy, 3.5. All right, you're starting to, yeah, you're middling in the amount of time you've been here. But compared to Bill, who's been here for 16 years and has been the contact point for so many of the individuals that have opened, individuals and organizations that have opened funds at the foundation, losing him definitely has the risk of shaking the community's trust in the foundation. So as long as we can convey that we are all the foundation and we are all here to stay, and your funds and your trust is safe in us.
I was wondering, how many retiring EDs then serve on the board or take up some kind of advisory role?
I don't have statistics for that. I would guess that we will be asking Bill back to serve on the board at some point. I don't know for sure if we will, but
you're talking about continuity, and that would seem like a really good way to kind of like,
yeah.
oh, well, Bill's still involved kind of thing.
Yeah, and he certainly will continue in an advisory capacity, at least for a period of time, and ultimately, it's up to the new executive director, the new, or rather the board as well, to decide whether or not they want to ask him to come serve on the board. I can't imagine that being anything but a good thing, eventually. But I don't know if he'll be ready to start serving on the board right away. I think he's interested in tending his gardens and taking a break. But so that's what we're doing internally, externally, kind of the layout of our timeline. Does anybody have any other questions before I turn it back over to Lynn? Looks like a no.
Right, thanks. And that's an example of a good plan right there.
And actually, I think it's a break time, isn't it?
It is. I just want to say a couple of things. One is that I don't think they're in the packet, but there is a generic succession plan that everybody who is here will get, and it may, again, it will reflect a fairly large organization. But I just want to keep reiterating that there's elements that can apply to this size.
That'll be included in what we mail out afterwards.
Yeah, so that'll be there. And then just one other last thing that is a sort of give and take when we talk about succession planning. El Dorado is including Bill in the committee. Sacramento Region Community Foundation did not include him. And there's pros and cons. I was very frustrated, I'll tell you, once we started, I was involved in up to the time that the search started. And then it was crickets. And I kept saying, look, I know this job better than anybody. And trust me, I left under very good circumstances. It wasn't like there was any animosity or anything. And I thought, hello. But at the end of the day, I am really grateful that I wasn't included, because it turned out, and I didn't know this at the time, that we had some internal candidates. I didn't know that. It was all very well contained. And one of those candidates was hired after, a nationwide search right next door, my office. I would never, ever have wanted it to be, discussed, assumed, or whatever, that I greased the skids for that hire. She earned that fair and square without any influence from me. So there's, as I said, even though I did feel like I'd been kept current for 6 months, I was actually quite glad. So it can go either way. And then the other thing about Bill coming right onto the board, that's another discussion, because I think when a new ED comes in, it's pretty important that they establish their leadership. They establish their style. They establish their process and procedures if there are some changes to be made. Once the new leader has really established their footprint in the organization, then I think it's fine for old leadership to come back and be an advisory role or board or whatever. But I wouldn't bring, I would not want to have gone on our board right away. I may ultimately at some point. And I don't know that Bill should either for that. Okay, I think we have a break, 10 minutes.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Oh, good. Eat a lot. And restrooms are right out the door.
Come on. There's 5 big boxes in here.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed some of this beautiful food that is laid out for us. That blueberry cake, you were right. I went back for that. I thought, I'm just going to have ahead. I went back and had it. So we went through succession planning. It's kind of long and tedious. We're going to do a little bit quicker thing on strat versus ops planning. Again, important as it relates to sort of staff role and board role. I think we kind of touched on some of that is what's the board responsibility in succession planning. It's important to understand who does what, right? So as I said at the outset, the organizations who responded to the survey, overwhelmingly indicated that they had a strategic plan. We're like, awesome. Then we looked and it said, how often do you review it? And we saw, the frequent review monthly, every board meeting, et cetera, just like I said, earlier, which tipped us off as we were thinking about the agenda that maybe there is some confusion between strat planning and ops planning. And they're related, no question, but they're two very different things, and understanding the difference is a key piece of staff and board governance questions. So, very quickly, the typical element of a strategic plan, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir with many of you here today, but it's really a long-term view of where the organization wants to be, and it could be a planning horizon of 3, 5, 7 years, right? It is typically driven by a mission and vision statement, and often supported by what's called organizational values. The vision statement details where the organization aspires to go. It's kind of the North Star. Why does your organization exist? It needs to be aspirational, but also reflects your core work. So, as an example, if the El Dorado Community Foundation had a vision that said, we are going to end homelessness in El Dorado County. That sounds great, right? No, they're not. They're gonna raise funds. They're gonna support those organizations. They as an organization are not gonna end homelessness in El Dorado County, right? The mission statement defines the business. So you come down a little bit. Defines the business, its objectives, and how it's going to reach those objectives. So it does feel a little more realistic, a little more tactical. And then the values, and I really love it when I see organizations that have values. because it affirms the elements of the organization's behavior, both internally and externally. So that when you're coming up against what some might consider a moral dilemma, if you're making a decision about something, going back to your values can really be a really soothing and comforting resource to have. So now, don't look at your slides now. Okay, turn them over. This is why we shouldn't include these. This was going to be a little test. I didn't think about it when we said we were going to copy the things, but so the importance of really identifying the importance of a mission and vision in terms of identifying who you are and what you want to be. Who's this one? To be the world's leading producers and providers of entertainment and information, with their mission to entertain, inform, and inspire people around the globe, with the power of unparalleled storytelling, reflecting the iconic brands, creative minds, and innovative technologies that make ours the world's premier entertainment company.
Disney.
Pardon me?
It's not Fox.
Disney.
It's Disney.
Disney.
It's Disney. But you know, what tripped up some people when we were even just talking about this is one to use. Information, where it says entertainment and information. But when you think now how Disney has like bought all these other companies, and so they're going well beyond the happiest place on earth. Maybe not right now in Florida, but so it does reflect their vision of how do we become this, and who we need to include in our family of companies to not just be thought of as an entertainment company or amusement park company. And then this one, to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world, to do everything possible as a vision. The mission to do everything possible to expand human potential.
Nike.
And I looked at that and thought, human potential, expand human potential. However, when you think about it, when you look at their advertising, and again, these things should drive their communications, it should drive their advertising. They talk about shoes that can help even the most unathletic person take a good walk or whatever. So, I really actually like that one very much the more I thought about it. And then this one, to provide access to the world's information in one click, to organize the world's, as a vision, as a mission, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful.
Google.
Right. And so it's a good thing when you actually can guess them, even if it's not there in front of you, because it means that they are living they're starting to achieve their vision, and they're living their mission. Okay, and then this last one, the vision is a thriving and resilient region where generosity and collaboration create equitable opportunity. Huh? I'm sorry?
It's the next slide.
Okay. Oh, thank you. And the mission statement is the foundation leads, serves, and inspires enduring philanthropy for a just and vibrant region.
Or
Here's
Sacramento.
Sacramento.
Look at the word region in there.
Yeah.
No, this is actually, the reason I brought this to the fore is that I mentioned earlier, we had just, at the Sacramento Region Community Foundation, we had just done a strategic plan. And it is amazing how this, you wrangle over these and the words, if it really does, it's really going to drive what you're doing. And we didn't see it as, what we talked about is that we really see that we are the organization, just like Alvarado is in their footprint as well, but to drive generosity, to enhance individual generosity, hence things like Big Day of Giving and other things where we're not a Fortune 500 market. So if we're going to enhance generosity, it needs to be through individual philanthropy. That we have the platform to collaborate, and I mentioned we finished a DEI plan, and really we're driven by equitable opportunity. And that as a mission we lead, serve, and inspire. Enduring philanthropy, and the word enduring, we went around and around, believe it or not, but that's because we have a high level of endowments. So we see our mission as continuing to be a source of enduring philanthropy by raising endowed dollars for the region in perpetuity.
You pointed out earlier, just before you left, that there was I think you called it a project for creating more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization is kind of moving forward.
Yeah.
And you sure see it a lot. That do you have equity, inclusion, and diversion
Right.
statement, and then to see how you've woven that into the vision statement, kind of a good move, I think, especially the equity piece. The other's important too, but that equity is.
Well, and we're just.
That's
Just
true.
wasn't in our old one. And I noticed that there is, and from those are the College Foundation here, there's a mission and vision right behind you.
Mhm.
And then there's another mission over there that's painted in the wall, on the wall. I don't think it's the same mission. Is that old or is that old?
It's the vision top left.
Are they the same?
They're the same.
Oh, okay. All right, I guess I just looked at this side. But anyway, so perfect example. And it's really good. I read it before. I was gonna take a picture of it and read it and see if people would figure what it was, but
Well, that's the college, and then the foundation
Ah.
is different,
Good-
and we
good point.
support the college, and then the college is about to go through, our 50th is in 2024-25, so they're gonna redo, and then we can't redo until they redo,
Gotcha.
just we're behind them.
so it's, do you want to, Chris, you just want to read it real quick? It's very good. So it's for the college. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, so the vision is California's premier destination community college. The mission is Lake Tahoe Community College serves our local, regional, and global communities by promoting comprehensive learning, success, and life-changing opportunities. Through quality instruction and student support, our personalized approach to teaching and learning empowers students to achieve their educational and personal goals.
Now, some would argue that's too long. I do. But you see the difference there, right? I mean, between that mission and vision, and it's very, very directive. Yeah,
Can I ask
sure.
something? You also had on the list values. Can you give some concepts of
Yes. So,
values?
so these actually are the values that followed the mission and vision for the Sacramento Region Community. And it's driving the internal and external culture. So leadership, for instance, I think, and I know that you all went through this too, community foundations used to be sort of transactional. They would raise funds and then they would grant out the funds and so forth and so on. What's been happening more and more, evident again is Alvarado as well, is community leadership, where the organizations are moving from transactional to strategic into community leadership. And that we felt was very strong, a very strong value that we wanted to make sure we maintained. Stewardship really relates to the stewardship of funds. The foundation would not exist and we would not have the confidence that we have in our fund holders if we didn't do a good job of stewarding those funds. Ethics, goes without saying, equity, learning, just making sure that we always fostered a culture of continuous learning. Very often, we all get so busy and we're sort of heads down, and as an organization, and this is something the board too should keep an eye on, is we want to make sure we're growing everybody there, And then teamwork is just that. That we work together as a team, we don't work in silos, and we work with the community as a team. As well as a leader and a convener and all the other things. And there's descriptions for each of these in terms of how it applies to the foundation. But that also was an interesting exercise because we worked more, frankly, with the board on the mission and the vision. We went to the staff on values. It was like, how do you want to see this organization conduct itself? How do you want to conduct yourself? The board ultimately had to approve that because it was part of the strategic plan, but there was key employee input into everything, but particularly into these values.
Was that process simultaneous? Were you talking to the board about mission and vision at the same time you were talking to the staff about the values?
Yeah. We actually had, well, I should qualify that a little bit. All of that was part of the strategic planning process. We started with the mission and vision, that was mostly board driven. From that, we used that to then say, okay, what values is going to drive this organization in order to reach this mission and vision? So it was sequential.
Was that an original piece, or was that revisiting the mission and values? after-
Revisited, 100%. We actually ended up doing it 6 years. We had hoped to do it 5 years, but because of COVID and also because of the reports of the DEI plan.
So you updated that?
Yeah, we completely said, it's a whole new world out there now. Let's start fresh. Where do we want to be? What's our North Star? How do we get there? And how do we conduct ourselves? So getting back just for a moment to, any other questions? It's really a fun process, but God, it can be tiring. Yeah?
I was just going to share, we a number of years ago did values for the kids.
Oh.
And then we realized, well, we should link our donor, our annual giving to this so that they also are part of that values and kind of realize the work we're doing with the kids. And then now I think recognizing, okay, well, should be the values that are also driving, our recruitment or our, staff evaluations and everything. So we're kind of we've been trickling it throughout over the last few years.
Nice.
And it's really nice because
Yeah.
if you just bring everybody back to one
Yep.
focal point.
Yep, that's what I mean. It just can be very comforting when you think, wait a minute, are we going a little sideways here on something? And then to just stare at these and say, are we exhibiting leadership here? Or are we off base, I mean, are we trying to do something that another partner is already doing and we could be, working together rather than competing? I mean, so it really does pose a lot of questions as values that could be great, really. And it really makes you feel good. It's like, okay, we're living our values, right? So just real quickly, this sort of, and again, I'm sure most of you know this, but the strategic plan, it's a high level goals. And I'll say less is more. People who study strategic planning for a living say that there should be no more than 5 high level goals. And if you have 3, that's great. If you have 2, that's great. 4, that's okay. If you have 7, it's going to be, it's going to be on the shelf, that book, and you're never going to achieve it. Those goals should be supported by identifiable outcomes that are measured at the end of the strategic planning process, not early on, but at the end of the process, and identifying those activities along the 5-year plan, let's call it a 5-year plan, identifying the activities over the course of that 5-year plan that will need to be undertaken, driven by the stated measurable outcomes you've said at the outset about here's what this is going to look like when I achieve this goal. These activities then should be reflected. So let's say you've got a 5-year plan, you've started to think about what you're going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 to get to that 5-year outcome. What you're doing in year 1, 2, 3, 4, those should be the activities that end up in your operations plan. Because that's your activities. That's what you're going to do on a yearly basis to achieve what is your higher level goal. And that's why when it's done correctly, a strat plan and an ops plan tie together really nicely. The elements of the ops plan, as I just said, should be the activities that are mentioned in the strat plan. It should form the basis of what you're doing every year, tied to the annual budget, and tied to performance reviews. So you're looking, this ops plan is really your roadmap for a 1 or 2 year operation, depending upon the type of organization you have. Maybe annuals it's not relevant, but shouldn't go certainly beyond 2 years. And the ops plan is what should be reviewed regularly. Operations, and this is staff driven, should look at how are we doing against our ops to determine the process, to determine the progress, also to identify that, whoa, we put this together. We didn't know we were going to be doing emergency work because of a fire, where we had to put everything on hold. We didn't know we were going to have to shift everything, into pandemic phase. So of course you can't. None of this, is like so rigid. You have to make sure that you acknowledge that things can come over the transom. But that's why you need to review it regularly, and that's why things like, in board meetings, just doing what we call not a roadmap, but a dashboard. We said we were going to raise this much money. We raised even more, so we're well into the green. That's where the board just looks at that and says, good job, folks, or why aren't we achieving? But it's really, that ops plan is really driven by staff. So again, they're very related. Think of your board focused on your strategy, your staff, your leadership focused on the ops plan. So that's really all I have to say about that. Sorry, I didn't move this forward. Guys. Any thoughts about that? Does that sound realistic? Does it sound like nothing, doesn't reflect your?
So we went through this recently, and truth be told, the Boys and Girls Club had never really had a strategic plan before, so starting from the ground up, which was interesting. So I think we were also very excited and had lots of goals and thoughts.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to really emphasize that worked well for us is doing a lot of the legwork ahead of time for using technology that exists, right? Doing staff surveys, getting input, getting board input. And I feel like and getting kind of smaller groups of staff together to kind of put things together. And if anyone's where they're just starting to think of a strategic plan, it was so beneficial to have a lot of that groundwork done, because I have been in those board meetings where you sit for 2 days and try to make something, and I just wanted to point out that it was much more effective to use the technology we have now and getting information.
What are your high-level goals?
So that's a good point. Or our high-level goals. So it has to do with being the leader for children in our community. I mean, do you know?
Expanding service.
Expanding services.
Okay, the main goal is expanding services for children.
And being a leader for child programs in our area.
Be a leader, expand service.
There's a financial viability.
Retain staff.
Retain staff.
And then a financial viability one.
Yeah.
And
as
be
well.
financially viable.
And I should say, we did have a strategic plan before.
Okay.
I've written a 3-year one, and then for a period of years, it was just build a building.
Yeah. Right. It was
then we were like,
goals.
okay, we achieved that now. But I will say, Molly's process was incredible, and she's available for hire, very reasonable rates. But it actually was so useful, and one of the things Molly alludes to is doing surveys. So we did a parent survey, a staff survey, and we had kid information from a prior survey. It was really useful because, for one key example, our board thought it was absolutely essential to expand our 401k. We surveyed the staff, and I think you and I were like the only two really interested in that. All the staff wanted paid leave.
Right.
And we got into strategic planning, and the board were like, no, they need to be thinking about their futures, blah, blah. And we were like, no. Like, you have to go with the data, and the data shows they want something else.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was kind of going through this pretty quickly about sort of the differences. But it is true that that a strategic plan shouldn't be done in a vacuum. And if possible, also surveying your key stakeholders in the community about what is their perception of your organization, where do they think, what are you not doing that they think you should be doing, or what do they think you're doing that you're really not doing, and so that all of that, and then certainly staff surveys, and in the case of Community Foundation, fund holder surveys. So we went into this plan, and here's this is too much to look at, but I was just like, we had 4 goals, and but we had objectives and measurable outcomes and the strategies, and supporting those goals. And this was a 5-year plan. But it was based on a ton of data. Not data that you necessarily love to hear sometimes, right? I mean, you think, oh, hey, we're kicking it. And then, you get some survey information back. Not so much. So, and you have to be thin-skinned, or thick-skinned, I should say, about that. So that as you're thinking 5 years in advance, all right, so our perception was this, the community's perception is that. How do we adjust our lens, really, to get to where they want us to be versus where we thought we were? So you're right, data, staff, funders, and community if you can do it. Okay. Anything else? You look like Green has a question. No?
No, I was evaluating our strategic plan that we just did last year. Based on what you were saying, I think we did a pretty good job.
Oh, yay, that's good, that's
So
good.
We do need a succession plan, we do not have one.
Most people don't, I know that was kind of probably a pretty tedious thing to go through, but it's tedious to do one, as I said, but once you do it, then you just have to look at it every year and you feel so much better about adjusting if it's planned or not. Anything else here? Because if not, we can go into our next, this is now the end of the download, I promise. Now we're going to go into our more interactive parts with your sick of hearing me talk. One of the things that another thing that helped drive our agenda, it was based on the survey that we did, which was, what is diversity? How are you defining diversity? And as I said, I was very impressed with the breadth of the answers that came back. And we also asked, have you achieved it? And a lot of people said yes, they had achieved it. They felt they had a diverse board. So what we wanted to do here is really open this up just for discussion on if you feel that you have had some success in attracting a diverse board as you're growing your board. How did you do that? I mean, what strategies did you use? Flip side is, if you're struggling, what are you struggling with? Because maybe there could be some groupthink here to help you address some of the challenges you're having. And if you are having challenges, I tell you, every nonprofit in the world is having the same ones. So does anybody want to open it up? Good, go.
Not diverse at all.
Okay.
we have a good balance of men, women. We have a good balance across a number of religions. We have a semi-good balance in ages.
I would say, and also skill sets.
Yes, I think we're definitely good on skill sets. And actually, when I came on, it was a little bit like, right, I want a lawyer, I want an accountant, I want, everything that you can get pro bono. But in terms of racial and socioeconomic diversity, we're terrible. I will say, if you want to clean out your board, do a capital campaign. We lost 6.
A what campaign?
Capital.
What does that mean? You mean like
And
build the building?
like,
It's too hard and nobody got it.
Well, and I think it was the best thing ever. Because, we're asking the board to step up and do a lot more work. We're also asking the board to put the money where their mouth is. And yeah, we lost 6.
Out of how many? How many are on the board?
I think when we started, we had 18.
Oh, wow, that's.
So it's like a third of the board. But who remains is incredibly committed. And during the capital campaign process, we did then recruit some more. Was it diverse? No. And I think this is where I have a bit of a struggle because I've always been taught your board are your donors and your fundraisers. So it's a very hard thing to then go out and be like, join our board, by the way, you have to give a lot of money. And you have to ask all your friends to give us a lot of money. I don't think that attracts diversity. And so what I think I know other clubs are doing is they're starting different committees. And I also know to kind of feed in. And then, and kind of having like a junior board of kind of like young professionals. That's attractive too, but God,
You gotta manage
as
that.
CEO, you just end up as like a committee wrangler.
And Jude, I think what you're describing too is that there's a lot of our board has been there since day one or day 5, you know, and so they're very valuable as well, and I think really important to the board, but that's also who stays by you, and so that often still reflects that less diversity because they've been there for so long. And we are diverse in different ways. You just described a bunch of ways, but definitely you've also highlighted.
Do you have term limits?
No, no, we don't. And actually, I know they're a good thing, but then I'm also like, gosh, there are some people who are just so incredible and so influential in terms of, you know, just engagement.
They're still very engaged. Yeah, it's not-
It would be such a bummer to lose them.
There is, in the world of DEI planning, board terms are considered pretty important. Because it does force turnover, which I know isn't always a good thing, but it does force turnover, and which opens up the opportunity to better diversify the board. But in a case like what you're talking about, so I mean, I don't think there's any right or wrong thing. In your case, what you're saying is that these are the people who are really the backbone of your board. You know, would they help you recruit their successors?
Oh, yeah. I think that some of them would also be super bummed not to be involved anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know that having term limits or having terms means that those folks don't stay involved or can't stay involved. And I think if you have committees of the board, you can have at-large members, and if you can allow that in your bylaws. And I think there are ways around that to incorporate those folks who have been important in the backbone of organizations while encouraging new blood into your organization, which I think is key.
Yeah. A lot of organizations will have a board emeritus kind of thing where former board members are treated with reverence, really, but they're not a voting member of the current board. But they do feel part, like you say, committees and others.
I think it's also, it depends on what kind of board you are.
Yeah.
I happen to work on a working board, all volunteers, no paid staff, and each board member has assumed a responsibility. And people get trained in that, and you don't want to let them go. It takes years to figure out that job.
Yeah.
And to let go of it, or to even find a new person that's willing to do your job is very challenging. They don't mind being on a board and attending the board meetings and making decisions and being involved, but they don't want to do week-to-week work that.
And I think what I see in Bread and Broth is the friendships there as well, like that community you've created, which is so important to so many.
Yeah.
A little different.
Yep.
Is this now the time to mention we're doing speed dating?
Again?
October 4th, if that's a Wednesday, otherwise it's the 5th, at Boys and Girls Club.
Yep, we are doing the speed dating
We are doing
again.
speed dating.
Hopefully that wasn't a surprise to Jude,
No.
since it's going to be at Boys and Girls Club. So last year, we did, and I don't know how many of you were able to attend, we did speed dating between community members and nonprofit organizations to help them find and recruit new board members. It was very successful, it played out very well.
So I'm working on hitting up different people this year for it. Last year I went and hit up service organizations, and we did put it in the paper with Paula at South Tahoe Now. But we're going to work on hitting different organizations, not that we don't want the same people that are community members, but we also are looking for people who maybe don't have as much experience, like service club members and stuff. So it might be the way to increase the diversity, but I do think then the education comes from you guys if you choose one of these board members, because some of them have very little experience on the board. But it was a very fun evening, and I would encourage you all to attend. We're going to put an email Eventbrite signups, nonprofits. You guys went a lot faster, both sides, but we have to have the same number. And we've learned a few things from last year. I'll have some people on the wait list show up But we do have to have the same number of nonprofits and community members, because it is true speed dating.
So I'll jump in just from the perspective of an emerging nonprofit. And we'd spent a good 2 years as just partnering, and it was kind of interesting because Bill was actually one of our speakers. Just while we were forming things, I started this little platform. The good news about pandemic was just how people were willing to come to Zoom things. And what it was called was Good Things to Know. So I started out just very aggressive that it was, you know, just every month we had a good thing to know, and people would come on and there'd be, you know, 15 to 25 people on the call, and it was definitely geared toward where we were headed with serving transitional age at-risk young people, but just a lot of mental health issues that are just alive and well in the community. And then within a good period of time, about a year of just kind of meeting casually, that it had been on several people's mind to start a nonprofit. It's not like we just pulled it out of our hip pocket, but just we're seeing the need. And I kind of reached out to a few community members who I really value their role in the community and their feedback, that it is just crazy to start a new nonprofit. And I think even Bill was on one of the good things to know, like, so help me understand what's different about this, and are you competing for the same things? And it's like, no, it's all collaboration. So long story short, fast forward, the person who I just truly admire this person, and are we crazy? It's the height of the pandemic, and here we are starting a new nonprofit, and what are we thinking? And basically the response was, no, it's a gap that's not being met in our community. So fast forward to starting to get board members, it was, do we have a qualified, you know, a strong financial person? Not yet. Do we have someone who can do websites and things? Not yet. But what we did, we laid out our structure that it was board driven. The committees aren't quite there yet. We have an executive committee, and the next one we saw the most need for was legal and compliance, just because different policies and stuff when you don't have a staff to oversee some of those things. But I'd love to have it be, or we would love to have it be stronger committee-wise. But the next layer was identifying community sectors that were relevant to our mission and our vision. And they included education, service providers, the youth we serve themselves, community members. So within that, there's like, you know, 50 different organizations that are somewhat involved in our organization. So the board, just because that's how it happened, I do feel that we are diverse with representation of most of those sectors, if not multiple ones, especially education is a big piece for the transitional age youth we serve. We have a couple people from the Lake Tahoe Community College where, you know, education and job readiness is huge. And you know, law enforcement, and we have so I do feel that diversity, I was glad for you to say that it isn't always the representation of the ethnicity or the you know, the age or whatever, that it can be diverse in other ways.
You have a diverse board. I think that's a perfect example. Thank you for sharing that, because and I just want to sort of play off a little bit when you said, you know, who can I get pro bono work from? That's also important too. But are those, is that lawyer, is that, you know, marketing person or whatever, do they have any connection with your mission?
Oh,
Yeah. So, I mean, and you clearly do have a connection with your board members have a connection with your mission. They're collaborators with you. So you know, that's a perfect definition in my view of a non-traditional diverse board. And I think you've done a great job of pulling that together. Anybody else have any examples of anything that they've done that's worked or not worked? How about you? I know you've got a...
No, we're a funny little group. our goal is just to raise funds to support senior programs and services. So mostly that's what we do. And it started because some people that worked in senior services in El Dorado County has seen times when people left money in their will
Yep.
and the county put it in general fund.
Ooh.
Or they never did anything with it. So it was county employees that came, and because I was volunteering at the senior daycare, they pulled me in, and so we started a nonprofit, but they couldn't be on it. So we just raised money. That there's been 7 of us, now we're down to 6, so we're gonna look for somebody. But it's just, we have like 3 teachers, 2 lawyers, no, 4 people, 1 of the lawyers was in education first, and then the other 2 lawyers had run the senior legal program in the past. So we're just very connected to senior needs, and so whoever wants to, and then we pull people in for the fundraisers to help us with those.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, to be controversial, I think we need to rethink the way we do boards entirely to really get to diversity. I mean, for some people, particularly our younger generations, like every month sitting for an hour in a room, like looking at a P&L report is totally unattractive. You know, some of the things is what time of day you're doing these board meetings. Others is, are you providing childcare at the same time? You know, could you do this all on Zoom? You know, I think we, as nonprofits, we have to start thinking outside the box. And truthfully, do we even need to run board meetings in the way we do? You know, could you have an executive and then the board is more action driven?
Or fun? Jude, are you excited?
You are leading us right into our next section.
Excellent.
Yep. And so we're going to leave the diversity piece here, but I think just the message to leave with is there's no perfect definition of a diverse board. You know, sometimes there's pressure to say we need to reflect our communities. You hear that all the time. Well, okay, if I was talking to a woman in Placer County, for instance, and she's very committed to racial and ethnic diversity, but she said, you know, if I'm really reflecting my community, it's 95% white and affluent. Is that what she wants her board to be? So you've got to really trade off some of those things. And I we didn't come to any perfect answer here, but just again, I don't think there's a perfect definition of a diverse board. But I would just say, you know, keep and this is also ties back to the importance of a strategic plan, because when you're thinking about where you want to be in 5 years, how do you populate your board with expertise or with community representatives or members of certain demographics that could help you get there, so you're not just looking at it today. Okay. So anyway, I think we should go on to the problem statements.
The board meeting has low attendance and lack of engagement.
Hey guys, hold on, we're starting.
The ED has gotten feedback that the agenda is too full. There's too much download with not enough discussion. So our ideas were to basically cut the agenda if it's too full, if that's the feedback. Really, that's what you have to address. But there are many ways to address that. You could have a consent agenda, and then your agenda be smaller for the meeting.
Just the action items then, rather than the report outs, which could be written.
Yep.
And that was the second thing, to be action oriented. So the actual meeting, you have to decide things and how they're going to do, not just listen to downloads of reports, but ask for their feedback on different ideas, on problems that you have to address. Also, this is in general feedback that hybrid meetings, to allow different ways to attend meetings, it increases the attendance.
Okay. One thing to be cautious about there, and I'll just mention, is that you have to make sure that your bylaws accommodate that. Sometimes in person is required for quorum, but if your bylaws say that you can have hybrid
Yeah, and
When your bylaws were written 30 years ago and make no mention of whether it's in person or not, I assume you're good to go.
yeah, we actually recently amended our bylaws to allow hybrid and email voting.
Right. I'm like, was that email in our bylaws were?
Yeah, they're old.
I'm
I
sure
mean,
some of
ours were only 15 years old and they were outdated as far as the modern ways of communication. Another idea was to have committees and delegate the work to committees. That was his example, Dick's example. Because they do their work and their committees are empowered to make decisions. So some of the work is funneled to the committees and they have monthly meetings, so more often. And so when the board meets 3-4 times a year, it's less of that everyday work, it's more strategic decisions and action-oriented items.
So does the board have to, in your structure there, does the board have to approve the committee recommendations, or are the committees empowered to act?
Certain things the committees are empowered to act, but there are other things that do take board approval. So, yeah, and if they're timely, you know, we can do an email
Okay,
vote
yeah.
or whatever. But, yeah.
Okay. Can you give an example? I'm curious of like what would be something that would be actionable by just the committee without board approval, and what would be required?
For instance, our finance committee, we're just going through our audit, and so decisions related to the audit, picking an auditor, you know, receiving the audit, that kind of stuff, like, and.
But your board would have to approve the audit, correct?
The audit itself, right?
Well, he's in Nevada too.
Yeah, I didn't know
But
that.
she just-
There's no rules in that.
Fair enough.
It's,
Generally, whatever's in the bylaws, so,
right.
right? So
Yeah.
you're a
So I
bylaws.
think probably, yeah.
Okay, just
So,
curious.
you know, adopting a budget, that takes board approval,
Okay.
that kind of thing.
Okay.
And then I threw out an idea to make the board meeting fun. So we do one of our board meetings a year to be a hike or a party or go to a brewery. It's kind of a social event, but we also go through a couple of hikes. And sometimes we tag them on to an end of an actual event, like a planting or a watering, so where they got to see the constituents, do the activity, and then Jude was added that for their board, they also have an engagement with the kids, like it's a part of, I don't know if it's a part of the board meeting, but because the board meetings are at the building where the kids are, so for a certain amount of time, you get to engage in what your organization does.
And we could do a better job of that, for sure. Like,
I like that idea of making at least one of the board
Yeah.
meetings fun. Yeah. Who
That's
else
it.
had number one? Oh, I'm sorry, was
That was it.
who else had problem statement one? Why don't you guys go ahead? Who's,
I had a question about hybrid meetings. Is there something with the Brown Act with open meetings and having it, if your meeting is Zoom or?
that's government.
yeah,
That's
government.
right.
Nonprofits aren't in the Brown Act.
Yeah.
So nonprofits.
I mean,
are not-
it's recommended to follow a lot of that, but it's not.
It's not
Brown
law,
Act.
it's only law for government,
Okay.
government agencies.
There is like,
Nonprofits.
there are laws for nonprofits though, but they're not governed by the government.
So did you have anything to add to some of the suggestions from this table?
Don't just say ditto.
Sure, so involving board members at a committee level, so then they are speaking, board members are reporting out at the meeting versus staff. And sometimes I will contact board members in advance and prep them and ask them to speak on topics at meetings. What else do we have there?
I agree with that. A lot about sharing success stories,
Yeah.
keeping things positive and upbeat is helpful, or getting them more involved in what is actually happening. Like, kind of like they said, the whole idea of what you do at your meeting reflects what actually is happening.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a student who is a member of the foundation board, and I, prep them and ask them to speak out, that it's important because they are the voice of the students who we are making decisions to support them. So it's important that we understand what actually helps them, what's their point of view.
Can I, what Molly just said about making positive comments. So I was actually executive coaching a Boys and Girls Club CEO. And one of the things she was really working on was board relations. And we were kind of discussing it, and we were realizing that your board often hears the worst things. It's like, oh, we didn't get that grant, or oh, this is happening, or we're having this HR issue, blah, blah, blah. And one of her things was she felt that she really wasn't, she felt she could be fired at any time because of that perception of her. And we realized some of it was like, she was not celebrating her successes with the board. And so we, funny enough, I kind of came back and went, we don't do that.
Well, it's true because you always present the problems because you want solutions, but you don't. But what you've dealt with, you don't really present that as much.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, because there's so many things, as working board members or CEOs that you just deal with, and get over. And I was like, oh yeah, we really need to do that with our board. So actually, then they walk out the meeting and were like, I'm part of an amazing organization.
Okay, anything else from your table? No? I've had a couple of suggestions. So I like the idea of, again, size allowing, to have committees do some of the reports, so it's not just the board chair or the ED who's droning on. Absolutely do a consent calendar. If these are routine approvals, and that will cut out, gosh knows how many items. The other thing that I found incredibly helpful to getting our board meetings a little more jazzed up was doing first of all, sending out the packet at least a week in advance, so that there is an opportunity, and let them know. Let the board members know that they need to come prepared, because we're not going to talk ad nauseum. And with that agenda, a CEO report that does celebrate the good news, that provides more detail on maybe something that's an agenda item, so that if they read it, they're prepared to come discuss it, as opposed to, okay, now we're going to get the lesson on the audit or whatever. And I also, and I love the idea of play, having some opportunity to have social interactions. It may even, require adding a board meeting perhaps. How often do you all, how many of you have a board meeting every month?
11.
So you got 11, okay. How many every other month? Okay. How many every quarter? Okay. Oh, okay. One thing to think about is, particularly if the board isn't engaged with each other, which I think we've all found as a challenge due to COVID, is maybe think about more opportunities for boards to get together either at a meeting, so maybe increase the number of meetings, or have just something fun, so that the level of engagement among board members increases. And the idea that you all talked about the good news and making sure that the board is proud to be part of this organization. If you have a building like you guys do where they could see the work that they're helping support, that's really, really a good thing. Where you don't, one thing to do is maybe have a grantee of yours, someone you're working with. Someone who's a success story, come in and tell their story to the board. How this organization helped transform whatever address their problem or help transform their life. It's just amazing to see these folks who are like, yikes, we didn't really know. Also, one other last thing, and we'll go into problems too, is that very often, along those same lines, boards don't feel connected to the mission. Particularly if they are on the finance committee, or the audit committee, or the investment committee, or whatever they happen to be, if they're not necessarily related to grants, and they're not necessarily related to community work, have a mission moment at every meeting. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the, who you bring in, although that's great if you can do that, but even if you can't accommodate that in your agenda, have a mission moment which will set the stage for a positive view of what they're sitting down to spend 2 hours to do, and set it off in kind of a nice way. So those are just a couple of suggestions. All the other ones you had, I fully agree with as well.
Can I just maybe ask a question about this one is, do any of the boards, does the board members set the agenda or bring up topics that they want to talk about, rather than it coming from the ED or from the board chair? That might also develop more engagement if the board had input to what it is was going to be discussed.
But a lot of times they don't, like I send them an email, hey, what do you want, what do you want to discuss at the next board meeting? Do you want to present about anything or do a certain question? And a lot of the times they don't.
Right.
But sometimes I'll be like, how about you were involved in the website? Can you discuss the website, the new website or something like that? Yeah. So you can sort of assign them.
Or at least find out what, if they're not, if they lack engagement, what do they want to engage in?
Right.
That's
good. I mean, as much as you're right, as much engagement, communication. I mean, ultimately, it's got to. I mean, some business is prescribed that has to happen at the board meeting, right? And so clearly, that part of the agenda is pretty much, mandated, if you will, or expected. But then get creative, like bringing somebody in, or having those mission moments, or having a topic that is suggested by a board member. It's easier to do that when you have more than 3 or 4 board meetings a year ago. So just thinking about that.
One of the things that we do at the Eldorado Community Foundation is we, at the end of each board meeting, we invite board members to report about anything that is happening in their fields of work. And we have, one of our board members is Dr. Edmond Ansala, who's the county superintendent. And he'll oftentimes share things about like what's going on in the school systems. And so that really helps drive their engagement as well, because then they get to report back about something that's not necessarily foundation related, even though in some ways it sometimes kind of ties back in. But
So should we go into?
Just on that, do you ask that it's somehow related to the foundation?
Not necessarily. No, it doesn't have to be.
Make it scary though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it depends on who's on your board. Are they going to start talking about, their cat? So it's we don't have that.
Or a sales pitch, for their business is more my concern.
I think if something like that were to happen, I think that would be a good, kind of teaching moment for maybe the board president, executive director to step aside with that person after the fact and let them know, hey, so that wasn't really appropriate. Because you definitely don't want to have like sales pitches, and that's not the kind of thing that we're asking for at the end of our board meetings. It's more of a, hey, is there anything you want to share about what's going on? And the example I gave with the superintendent is a good one because he oftentimes has things that are going on at the county level to share. For Eldorado Community Foundation, most of our board members are tied in some way to the community in various ways, where they have those things they can kind of share. If you've just got if one of your board members is just like Joe from down the street, maybe what they have to share isn't necessarily going to be relevant to.
So I guess it's stating it that, do you have something that's important for this group to hear?
That's a good idea.
So I had another perspective on that, and this would only really work with a small board and if you have time, but I found that even those report outs that might be something more personal, like an exciting win for someone's family or something like that, that really helps drive that connection amongst the board members. So then all of a sudden, somebody whose industry I might not relate to, now they're relatable, and now we have a connection, and now when we go to do some work for our organization, we already have that connection going forward and we get ground. So I think those interpersonal interactions are also really
That's an
important.
excellent point. Okay, we can move on to problem statement 2. Go ahead, and who's going to report from this table?
Okay, so our problem is, so the board acts and feels disconnected. Meeting attendance is low, financial support is anemic, enthusiasm in the community is waning, and the ED has received feedback that board members really don't understand their role. So what steps could be implemented from recruitment through the end of their terms to keep board members engaged and accountable? And we all talked about the importance of a recruitment package, and so knowing kind of what your steps of board recruitment are and making sure that part of that includes maybe, like for myself, I went through the process of developing a package. The organization I was with didn't have one, and so I was sure to include like what the board expectations were, and then that goes back to making sure that they reflect the bylaws, so hopefully the bylaws are up to date. But so kind of a list of the board expectations, a list of all the different things that we do, and finding out what they're interested in being a part of at that time. An application, Bread and Broth does a resume that they require and an interview. So just that whole recruitment piece alone could really make or break somebody's experience in the board process. And we kind of tied that to the meeting attendance being low, and then the last one, the board members really don't understand their role, and so we thought that could really be kind of attacked at that front end. Then after that, again, there's that engagement piece, and with the enthusiasm in the community waning, we didn't get to financial support, we didn't have time to talk about that piece yet, but we went right to the enthusiasm in the community waning, and I'm interested to hear what other people say. I know in my experience, that's really tied to their connection to their role on the board, right? So like if you have a board, and my experience is all in very, very small nonprofits, where the ED was doing everything. And so we really rely on the board members to know what their role is and to be enthusiastic in the community. And if they don't, they're kind of, it's like, they're so interconnected. So we talked about, let's see, my notes, I can't even read my own writing here, but Bread and Broth meets with each board member annually, and so that helps them stay connected with the mission, finding out what their experience is going like, so that if there is room for improvement, the ED can be part of that process. And then some of the things that have worked anyway for me to keep them engaged is involving them annually in a planning meeting, and then kind of going back to that strategic plan and saying, here's what we're doing, and here's how your role connects to some piece of that strategic plan. Making, again, committee leads was mentioned earlier, and that whole communication piece that you're part of, if you don't have a big enough staff to have a communications role, maybe appointing somebody on the board to take on that role so that you're sure to keep that engagement and help the community continuously understand who's part of the organization.
Internally as well.
Internally as well, right.
Just keep that communication going within the board so that they don't lose their enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And you brought up the newsletter. I think if you have a communications person who's able to do a newsletter and keep your volunteer base involved in what you're doing, as well as reaching out to media resources in the community constantly. We have a good community about publishing most anything you want, so to kind of keep that word out there. And another thing in South Lake Tahoe is they have a collaborative. So once a month we meet, and people begin to know what different organizations, nonprofits do.
So we talked about one solution is to kind of understand have the board members understand what the expectation is of them. I was saying on our board currently, I think that there's a little bit of a difference between what the ED wants and what the board does and expresses what they want by doing what they do. So I think she wants a little bit more of a working board, and the board wants to be a little bit more of a governing board. And we have a small staff. It's an ED. She does a great job. She does a newsletter. She's done a good job in building membership, but we could use more. She does a great job planning events. She does lots of really good things. But we do have a little bit of this disengagement going, and in part it might be the way that the meetings are run. And then another one is, I think, what she wants and what the board does is a little bit different. And then the board comes in and we have a really casual recruiting process, which is that they come and they're invited to a meeting. They see what the meeting is like, and then we ask them if they want to be a member. And that's it. And so there's
You
no
corner them. And
yeah, there's no like process
That's
where
what
they're saying they're interested or yeah. So I think that you suggested the expectation, outlining expectations. I think that's a really good one. And then having the board understand what their contribution needs to be and why they're there, not just because they're there to join the board, but rather that they have something to offer.
And I think the other part of it that, that we run into, especially in the nonprofit world that we're all here, a lot of people have passion for the mission, and they think getting on the board will help that, but they don't understand the role of board members, that it's not just the passion, but there's a fiduciary and other responsibilities that go with being a board member that doesn't connect with them with their passion for the outcome. And I think you have to separate those and say, that's great, maybe you should be a volunteer with a board member.
I like the idea of outlining those expectations, because the more you manage their expectations, the better.
having a board onboarding process, a board member onboarding process. And we actually have, I'll be sending out in the packet that we send out after this, the foundation has a board packet that we introduce new board members to, helps them understand their responsibilities and the mission of the organization and all of that. So I'll be sending out it's just the cover, or not the cover sheet, but the table of contents. Because obviously it's going to be unique to the organization, but to see what we include in that, it's really important to help manage expectations of board members so that they know what they're getting into.
You're also going to get it's the Sacramento Region Community Foundation, so it's not going to be all that relevant.
Yes.
But I completely agree about the concept of a board expectation document. And you'll see how it was structured, and it was really well received, which is why I'm happy to share it. Is that there's sort of mandatory things, right? Certain meeting attendance, sitting on a committee, blah, blah. It's mandatory. Then, turn it over, and you'll see that there's more sort of discretionary activities. But it starts people to think, okay, maybe I can host an ambassador event in my house. Maybe I can call around during Big Day of Giving and help with, boosting people. Maybe I can do, so they sign off, they check all that, and then they sign it. So this word about accountability, so at the end, you're talking about meeting with your board members, you can use that expectation document to sit down and say, okay, did something change so that you couldn't attend meetings? It doesn't have to be like, so rigid or so punishing anybody. But when they thought they could do this, did something change that made it difficult for you to fulfill your commitments? If so, you want to leave of absence, or is this really the right board for you? So it really helps with those kinds of what can be difficult conversations. And I can't reiterate enough. I know you're going to see how El Dorado Community Foundation does it, but a really robust orientation. No matter what it is that you get, large, small, you're there for a purpose, and they should fully understand that purpose before they call themselves a board, before they fully, commit to being on a board, and also understand the the organization's business, so that they understand the financials, they understand how we report different things, how you do raise money, what the organization looks like, if it's all volunteer or if there's staff, So it just, I mean, I think doing a really good upfront job, and then an ongoing expectation, and they need to sign that expectation document every single year.
You know, we have job descriptions, because again, we're a working board.
Yeah.
So for example, on communications and grants, and every template is the same. So they have the time commitment, and the board responsibilities and specific. And the important part of that is you provide that to them when they apply. When you have your interview committee, we go over almost every responsibility.
Yep.
Are you able to do this? Here are our meeting dates.
Yeah.
Can you attend for a year?
Yeah.
The other part about meeting annually is it not only gives the director the opportunity to kind of check in and make sure you're fulfilling your responsibilities, but she's always very good about what do you need from me for the coming year, or how can I help you? And I think it's
That's
both
perfect.
ways.
And that expectations is so critical.
I have a question to everyone. How many of you have minimum fund buy-ins to be on the board of your organization?
People have to become a member, but that's anywhere from $50 to $500, depending on the type of member.
Yeah, because I hear that's very, very common, and particularly in sort of slightly larger nonprofits. But if you're going back to diversity, I think that puts some folks off.
It does.
We don't, by the way. You just have to give annually.
But I'll tell you what changed, I mean, we used to have one. What changed was our DEI roadmap, right? How we were applying this, because we do want a more diverse board. So basically what we said, I think that the language now says, give to the, something along the same scale as you give to other nonprofits or something. So, or what makes you comfortable.
For our capital campaign, we did a gift that is meaningful to you.
Yeah,
That
something
is-
like that. Yeah. I think that was exactly right.
Sacrificial, sounded a bit dramatic. So we
Your firstborn.
Yeah,
I swear right there. There's a federal grant that I'd rather just give my kidney. But yeah. And then my other one was, again, we don't do this, we probably should, but I do know that scorecards has been a thing in boards. So basically, you all score each other at the end of the year, and basically, like if you don't achieve a certain, how many board meetings did you meet, how, all that kind of stuff, you get looted.
So just a quick comment on the giving boards. So there are some organizations that require their boards to be 100% giving boards, and one of the reasons for that, which you probably know, is there are a lot of grants out there that they ask specifically that question: is your board 100% giving board? And you may or may not. It's hard to know for sure if that's going to completely disqualify you. But when you're filling out that grant application and you're like, well, shoot, is this going to, kill my chances of getting this grant if my board is 100% giving? So that's why a lot of boards are encouraged
It was
to
a
be.
big thing in the capital campaign as well, to be able to say that, not only am I myself as a staff member personally giving to this, but every single one of our board members is. And we've done a staff campaign that,
And the
X
numbers
percent.
weren't the end thing.
No, it's
just
the
yes and
commitment.
no.
It's the
Yeah.
commitment.
Yeah.
I have a question about that. Is that financial giving or could that be in kind?
Typically, that's related to financial giving only. But it is usually just a yes or no question. It isn't a, how much.
Yeah.
But to be able to be perfectly honest when you fill out that application, so that's why some boards, just $5 is all you have to give to at least be able to meet that threshold of being a 100% giving board. I'm personally of the mindset that I think I don't think grant applications should be asking that question, because it definitely
In this
goes,
day and age.
it goes against the desire to build a diverse board.
Right.
When you're trying to build a diverse board, a socioeconomically diverse board, a diverse board of individuals with different types of time commitments, working individuals who maybe have families that they're also trying to support. Monetary giving might not be an option for them. They may be able to give their time, their expertise, but not their money. And so, yes.
Well, because we have no monthly expenses, we don't have an office, we have a Google phone, so we don't have any ongoing expenses. And so we feel that it's the time that they're willing to put in. And all of our volunteers donate things for the event. We have a spaghetti feed and everything we get donated for the food almost. So we don't have that expectation. It's really about putting in the time.
I think it's time.
I think it's actually time to kick it over to wrap up questions and feedback. So are there any other questions before we turn you loose on the feedback forms and you write about how we could have improved and how wonderful this was? No more questions? Seems like. So at the back of your, at the end of your packet, the last page of your packet, or second to last page, should be a feedback form. Just 5 quick questions, if you wouldn't mind taking about 5 minutes or so and filling those out that we can collect before we go. And then, if you do find you have more questions, you know where to find us, or me at least.
And I just want to applaud the Alberta Community Foundation for doing these sessions. And it's really good. I know there's going to be a marketing one. One of my very favorite people who's going to be one of the presenters for that as well. So it's just, it's so valuable. And, we're nonprofits and we need capacity building. And I think so many nonprofits also, can benefit from capacity building. And this is a really good program that they're doing. Well done.